Something had been stealing from the park for weeks. Visitors were reporting belongings swiped from campsites. Members of the park service were losing personal items, things set down for just a second outside or left near an open window in the office. We always imagined that the culprit was human. We never entertained another possibility. Raccoons and magpies swipe little trinkets, sure, but not at a rate like our stuff was disappearing. We convinced our supervisors that a new security system was essential. Maybe we couldn't do anything about the campers losing their pots and pans, but we could at least secure the perimeter around the office. A date was set, roughly a week away, and we eagerly awaited the night that we would catch our thief in the act. We expected it was a squatter hiding somewhere in the park, avoiding our patrols and harassing our visitors. It was natural that we wanted them gone. But it didn't take us a week to discover the truth. It didn't take long at all for each of us to realize that what we were dealing with was far from natural. A loud metal grinding came from the parking lot one night. Something like a gunshot followed. We jumped to our feet and moved as quickly as we could. There were no visitors in the park, so no one was in danger, but the clamor was loud enough that we imagined the windows of our vehicles being smashed. It sounded like a sledgehammer had bounced off of the hood of someone's car. When we got there, that wasn't what we found. The vehicles were all in perfect order, but at the far end of the lot where our industrial-grade dumpsters were placed, something had moved. Something had toppled. An entire steel dumpster had been yanked onto its side. Its open top was flush with the pavement now, spilling out the garbage we'd collected throughout the week. We exchanged reasonably confused looks. What could be large or strong enough to turn one of those things over? A group of us could barely push them around when they were on wheels. Then came the shriek. It pierced our skin and shook our organs. My entire body went cold. Looking between the rest of the rangers around me, I knew they were feeling the same way. We were ghost-faced and wide-eyed. Our lips were trembling and our brows were doused in sweat. It was a sound none of us had ever heard before. It wasn't a man yelling. It wasn't an animal call. It was deep and ominous. Then it came again. This time the sound sent us running. We scattered. A few of us ran toward their vehicles, recognizing them as the nearest forms of shelter. I hadn't brought my keys from the office. I headed that way instead. But I wasn't alone in my movement. As I started running, I heard the brush crunching under the weight of something massive. The branches were snapping in a rhythm even quicker than my own exhausted feet. I risked a glance to the side. Something was running all right. Something larger than me, standing on two legs, with shoulders as wide as any one of our cars. It was massive. The thick fur on its body made the details hard to decipher, but I knew that it was big. It was big enough to crush me if it wanted to. It was big enough to beat me to the office. I tucked my chin and double-timed it. I ran so fast that I thought my toes might burst through the front of my shoes. I thought I might run out of my skin. That's how fast I had to move. It was either move that fast, faster than ever before, or be caught by the giant thing in the woods. I slammed into the office door, and it swung on its hinges. My hip crashed into the first desk. I hadn't thought about stopping. The furniture made for good brakes. I whipped back around, ignoring the searing pain in my side, and slammed the door shut. I heard another shriek as I turned the lock and started to brace the frame with the desks and chairs. I moved a locker in front of a window, peeking just once to check if another ranger was approaching the office. They weren't. The rest of them had found their own pockets of safety, I guess. This one was mine. I watched through the narrow gaps in my barricades, looking for the beast outside. I caught another glimpse of it just once. Its back was turned to me, stalking toward the forest. It had come and gone that quickly, I realized. It was entirely indifferent to the rest of us, unconcerned with whether or not we'd escaped. Had I overreacted? I didn't want to find out. I stayed put and watched the hairy humanoid mass disappear into the shadows. After that, one by one, the rangers returned. I unblocked the door and invited them in. Only a few of them had gotten a glimpse of the creature, and none were as vivid as my own. Most of them explained what I already knew, that something about the animal's scream told us all to run. Maybe it wasn't hunting us, but it still could have destroyed us with ease. We tried to talk about the encounter, but our superiors buried the story before the newspapers could swarm our little park. They didn't want to invite that kind of eccentric tourism, I guess. I wanted to invite a hunter. I wanted someone to track the thing down and eradicate it so I could feel safe at work again. That never happened. But the creature never showed up again either. Maybe it knew about the cameras we'd installed. Maybe it had a close enough encounter with humankind to last itself a lifetime. All I know is that it went away, and the stealing stopped. We hear a lot of stories up in these woods, and I never believed them until this past year. See, I live in Baudette, Minnesota. It's up on the Canadian border near Lake of the Woods. There's a Pine Island State Forest just south of town and the Rainy River to the north. That's also the Canadian border. Because of the river, it's the walleye capital of the world, home of Willie the Walleye. Point is, there's not much up here except the town. I mean, you go south into Minnesota, and there's nothing until Red Lake. It's woods mostly. In winter, it's cold, like to the point where you have to plug in your car at night if you want it to start in the morning. I travel a lot by snowmobile in the winter. It's just easier. Baudette's got about 1,000 people, which is about 1,000 too many for me, so I got me a house on the edge of town. My buddy Derek lives even farther out, not even in the city limits. He's not even on city water. People say Derek's crazy, but me, I just think he sees things other people don't see, you know? He pays attention. He doesn't have a smartphone or any of that. He watches things in the woods. One day last winter, I went out to see him because my grandma said my deer meat was taking up too much room in her freezer. I figured I'd bring him some and we could have a couple of beers and talk maybe. I took the snowmobile because I can take a shortcut through the woods that way, and I don't have to worry about whether the county plowed Derek's street. I set out later than I meant to, because of course Grandma wanted me to shovel the walk first. It was December, and it got dark around 4 o'clock. When I finally got the meat loaded and got on the snowmobile, the trees were already making long shadows on the snow. I almost didn't go, but if I tried to go the next day, she'd do the same thing. I got on the snowmobile, put on my helmet, and hit that path through the woods. The light lit up the trail pretty good, but I still took it slow. You never know when a deer might run out in front of you, and that could be the end of you. So I was going pretty slow, just watching the trees go by, when something did jump out on the trail. Jump isn't the right word. That thing strolled. It was a good 20 or 30 feet in front of me, but my snowmobile light lit it up really good. Still, I couldn't believe what I saw. It must have been 9 feet tall. I mean, I could see it was as tall as one of the pine trees. At first, I thought it must be some kid messing around because nothing has antlers and stands on 2 feet. But this was no kid with a costume. It had a skull for a face. I got one look into those empty eye sockets, and I almost fell off the snowmobile. I never remember ever being that scared. But just when I was trying to decide if I should turn around or not, it disappeared. It didn't walk away. It was just gone. So of course I wondered if it had ever been there at all. Maybe I imagined it. I thought I saw it, but once it was gone, I had my doubts. I told myself it was a weird hallucination and kept going. But when I got to the spot where it was, I smelled something rotten, like when hamburger meat goes bad in the fridge, except worse. Much worse. It only lasted for a second though, so I just told myself I was imagining things again. I blew past that spot and kept going to Derek's house. Like I said, his house is basically in the woods. He's got a dish on the side for the TV and a bunch of wood piled up on the side for the fireplace. That's the only heat he's got, so I just leave my jacket on when I go inside. He just had me put the frozen deer outside in the snow before I went in. Once we had a couple beers, I told him what I saw. He said, "Yeah, that's the windigo." Now I heard some stories about the windigo, but I don't know what to believe, so I asked him. He said all he knew was it wandered around the woods, quiet as death. He saw it out his window sometimes, but it never came up to the house because he made a circle of salt around it. Salt keeps all kinds of evil away, he said. I figured it was worth a try. I was scared to go home after that because, of course, by the time I left, it was full dark. I didn't see anything on the way home, though. I did smell that rotten meat when I passed that spot, though. I tell you what, when I got home, I got out that rock salt I use on the sidewalk and made a circle all the way around the house. Nothing happened for a while, though, and I kind of forgot about the whole thing. Spring comes slow up here, but it finally did come, and when the snow melted, I forgot to do the salt again. One morning, I looked out the window and there was a dead rabbit there on the lawn. Like not just dead, but torn to pieces. And other people around town started saying they found the same thing: rabbits, squirrels, even cats. I went out and did that salt circle around my house again. After that, I didn't find any more dead animals, but other people did. They tried to say it was wolves, but wolves don't do that. Wolves eat what they kill, they don't just tear it up. I know it was the wendigo. Derek says so too. I don't know how the last few winters were for you, but here in western Pennsylvania it was pretty crazy. Crazier than usual, which is saying a lot considering we're a state that gets hit with tons of snow every year. You better get used to snow if you're living out here. Another thing we have a lot of here in Pennsylvania is wildlife. Last winter I found tracks outside my barn, tracks I don't quite understand. They're clearly made from a canine, but no canine I know gets this big. They're pretty large in size, easily 12 inches if not bigger. We're talking huge canine tracks. Whatever made this had to have easily been the size of a grizzly bear, if not bigger. I know that doesn't even sound possible, but I cannot think for the life of me what dog breed can make these. The other thing that really bothers me is the track pattern is not quadrupedal, meaning it isn't from a four-legged animal. Judging by the way the stride is, it appears to be more bipedal. You can clearly see the stride pattern. It's like somebody was walking on two legs, walking around. And the other weird thing, wearing fake werewolf-canted boots. The impression in the snow is quite deep, meaning that whatever made these tracks not only had tremendous stride, but must have weighed a considerable amount. I'm around 270 pounds, a bigger guy if you will, and I'm 6'2". Even me with all my snow gear on and my boots can't even make half the indent as these do. So something is out there doing this. I know of dogmen, and I've heard their legends all around the entire Great Lakes area from Wisconsin to Michigan and even all over western Pennsylvania. I've never seen one myself, but I've heard many stories from friends and family growing up. I never really wanted to believe they existed, but now I guess I have no choice but to second guess. The footprints actually come out of a small section of woods that back up 2 acres of national forest. The small section of woods kind of tails out down to around where my house is and where the neighborhood is. I would say from my barn to the small section of woods or tree line is maybe 100 yards, but I haven't actually measured. The tracks lead all the way from the tree line to my barn and then just seem to disappear. There are no traces of which direction it went. And I don't think it jumped on my roof considering my barn is roughly 20+ feet high. So I'm not really sure what to make of this. The tracks just literally disappear right as they go up against my barn. And it's the backside of the barn where there's no window, there's no door. I currently do not have any live animals, just old hay and old barn supplies. So I'm not sure if there was anything remotely interesting for whatever animal making this to get into. I don't know. I have far more questions than answers, and I'm hoping with your aid, you can help me answer many of them. Sometimes it's the little things that stick with you. Well, I wouldn't say this was a little thing, but it certainly started out that way. It was 1997 and I was working as a park ranger at the time, working in the Shenandoah National Park. I'd been there for about a year and loved it. The pay wasn't great, but the benefits were good, and I got to be outside all day every day. That part of it was perfect. There were 2 other rangers on my shift, the day shift, at that time. We worked from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. with a 1-hour lunch break in the middle. My partner's name was Tim, and he was from the area, having grown up just down the road in Madison County. He knew this area like the back of his hand, and had been working as a park ranger for several years before I came along. I was still fairly new to the area though, so Tim would often give me little tidbits of information about where we patrolled each day or things he had learned over time while working there. One afternoon during our lunch break, he told me about some strange happenings that colleagues were talking about that had occurred at Bear Creek Lake State Park a few hours south of us. Tim said that he had heard stories from other rangers about strange sounds coming from the woods around the lake down there. He said that people thought it sounded like a woman screaming, but that it was much too loud and shrill to be human. He also said that he had heard some of the other rangers say that they thought it might be a Sasquatch or Bigfoot down there, but he didn't really believe in such things. I listened to Tim's story with interest, but I must admit I didn't put too much stock into what he was saying. After all, this was Virginia, and we're not exactly known for our Bigfoot sightings, at least not that I knew of. Besides, we were in the middle of a national forest and there were plenty of animals out there making strange noises. It could have been anything. I mean, bears certainly made plenty of noise when they screamed at each other during mating season, and deer could be pretty shrill when they watched over their fawns. So I simply filed Tim's story away in my mind and went back to work. Bear Creek was far enough anyway that I didn't worry about it. That afternoon we patrolled the north side of our area. We had a fairly large area to patrol, but it wasn't too bad since we could drive most of the time and only had to walk for a few minutes each hour. But it was during one of those walks that I first heard what could only be described as sounding like what we had talked about earlier, the Bear Creek Lake Screamer. We were walking along an old gravel road that led down to a small creek that fed into the lake. The trees were fairly thick here, and there was still some deadfall from recent storms littering the forest floor that we were heading out to check. I remember hearing something behind us as we walked down the road but didn't pay much attention because deer often moved through this area and sometimes even walked down this road. But then I heard it again. A loud cracking sound coming from somewhere in the woods just off the right side of the road, and then a screech. It sounded like someone stepping on a dry branch and breaking it and then screaming, but it was much too loud, and the sound was much deeper than normal. I looked at Tim, who had also heard the noise, and we both shrugged our shoulders. We couldn't really pinpoint what this one was. We kept walking down the road for a few minutes when suddenly there was another loud snapping sound from off to our right. This time I noticed that the sound seemed to come from a fairly large tree that stood about 20 feet off of the road and had grown to 40 feet in the air. The top branches were moving as if something had just jumped from them, down to the ground and moved away quickly. I looked at Tim again, who seemed just as surprised as me by what we saw, but neither of us said anything because we didn't know what it could be. I remember that my mind flashed back to Tim's story earlier in the day and wondered if maybe we had just encountered a Bigfoot. I kept that thought to myself, though, not wanting to scare Tim. Besides, we were still in the middle of a national forest and there were plenty of animals out there that could have made that noise. It could have been anything, right? Well, we eventually finished our patrol in that area without incident. But that afternoon we patrolled the south side of a assigned area, and as we drove down one of the roads there, I once again heard that same cracking sound coming from behind us. This time the cracking was much louder than before. Again, my mind flashed back to what we had seen earlier in the day, and I secretly wondered if this was another Bear Creek screamer. And then, sure enough, the screaming pierced through the air. It was shrill and loud and sounded just like a woman screaming. I looked over at Tim, who had a look on his face that I have never seen before. But all he could do was just shake his head, saying, "I don't know what that is." We both looked around for a while trying to find the source of the screams, but never did pinpoint anything. To be truthful, we only really half looked because I don't think either of us really wanted to find anything. And also, it was getting late in the day, and that was a great reason to head back to the main office. So we eventually gave up looking for whatever it was and didn't have to feel too guilty about it. I thought about those sounds for a long time, though, trying to work out in my mind what they could have been. And it didn't take me long to wonder if it could have been the Bigfoot Tim had talked about earlier. Like maybe it had traveled north and was now in our area. I mean, like I said, I didn't really believe in such things at first, but after hearing those screams, I'm not so sure anymore. Besides, Tim told me later on that he didn't want to admit this to anyone else because no one else believed in these things and they tended to just laugh at him. But he said he had heard the screams before and knew what it was, that it was the same thing they had been hearing down south. Personally, I've never heard them again, but I do still remember that sound like it was just yesterday, and I find myself becoming more and more convinced that it was a Bigfoot after all. It's one of those little things that continues to stick with me. The gray dogs were always part of our lives. Growing up in the Southwest, you just accepted always hearing about them. They were just always there. You might get told by your parents to come in by a certain hour, otherwise the gray dogs might get you. You might find a wild animal who met an untimely end. You would hear that the gray dogs were always responsible. You might even see them, ducking behind rocks, hunting from behind the bramble. If you saw the gray dogs, you always headed for the other direction. The kids who didn't do that, well, it never turned out good for them. I wasn't one of those kids, the brave ones. Or maybe they were the stubborn ones. Depends on who you asked. I did know a few of those kids, though. Jalissa from 5th grade ran into the gray dogs. They terrorized her family's ranch for a while. I remember hearing about their livestock going missing and then turning up drained of blood. I remember the drawings of 3 dots arranged like the points of a triangle. They populated Jalissa's notebooks for weeks. She couldn't get the shape out of her head, I guess. Eventually, I forgot all about her and what happened to her family. She got quiet, then distant, then altogether disappeared. So did her family. They moved, I guess. I didn't really think more about it. The old folks said it was the dogs that drove them out. I think by then I was already rooted in my disbelief. You see, I wasn't going to break any of the rules and invite the wrath of the gray dogs into my life. But did I think they could be responsible for so many things? Did I think they could drain the blood of a cow or chase a family off their property? No, I didn't. They were dogs, dumb as coyotes, I thought. Later in life, I was visiting home for the holiday. All memories of Jalissa long gone by this point. Even in November, my hometown doesn't get much colder than 60 degrees. It's a good place to head to and visit when you want to escape the snow. I didn't expect that my car would break down a quarter mile from my destination. I didn't think I'd end up walking, holding my cell phone above my head just trying to catch a glimmer of a signal. It was broad daylight and the walk wasn't terribly far. I figured that worst case I'd get to my parents' house and have my vehicle towed. Before I made it there, however, the gray dogs appeared. I heard their chattering first, like teenagers giggling under the bleachers. The high-pitched bestial laughter drew my eyes to the sides of the road in the direction of the sound. I spotted their little heads and their long ears sprouting up from behind the hills of rock and foliage. I didn't understand why they were laughing. It was so off-putting because, well, dogs don't laugh. Was it because I was alone? Was it because I'd finally made it all the way back home, right to the place that the dogs were waiting? Was it because of Jalissa? I say that I forgot her, but in reality, I just let her go. I let her drift away when she probably could have used a friend. But you don't think about those things when you're a kid. However, I think that the dogs might now be my karma. But of course, even if they were smarter than coyotes, dogs don't act like that. They aren't vengeful. They just happen to be there. And I just happened to be in their way. They came over the hills suddenly, descending on the road. There were 4 of them. Spines rose from their backs like barbed mohawks. Their eyes were bulbous and as animated as any man's. Their tongues were long and seemed to be prehensile. They curled and coiled in the dry air. Each long tubular tongue seemed to reach for me like an outstretched hand. I ran as quickly as I could. I feared what would happen if those tongues stuck to my body. I'd be covered in the same trinity that decorated Jalissa's notebooks. The 3 puncture marks left by the dogs. A triangular stamp was left in the place where they drained my blood. That's what they wanted, right? That's what it seemed like. They wanted my blood. I ran so fast that I ran straight out of my shoes. I ran until my socks were bloody. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs, and although the distance wasn't very far, I had to push myself to stay out of their reach. The dogs were fast. Even if there were only 4 of them, it felt like one was always at my heels. Another was always closing in at my side. They were surrounding me and urging me to run faster if I really wanted to escape. I did, of course. I crumpled onto my parents' porch and my folks came out yelling louder than I'd ever heard. The dogs scattered. They're fearful like other creatures, I guess. But that doesn't mean they're to be underestimated. We drove together back to my car. As we raised it onto the trailer, the dogs came again. They weren't done with me. There were 3 people this time, though. They couldn't just run into the group and try to get a bite of somebody. Luckily, we had safety in numbers. So they just watched, and they waited. They growled and they snarled, and they drooled thick strands of silvery saliva. They weren't laughing anymore. I'm not sure which sounds I preferred, laughing or the snarling. Both made me very uneasy. It was only on the drive back that I remembered Julissa at all. It all came flooding back, and I remembered growing up with the stories of the dogs. After moving away, those details seemed unimportant, but I should have known better. Now the last thing I'll do is forget those dogs. I've made that mistake once already, but never again. The longer they stay on my mind, the clearer the truth becomes. Of course, they were capable of running a family out of their home. Enough of those dogs seemed that they could do anything. They definitely could strike fear into a number of people. I think those dogs were capable of all those things and more. It was just a matter of crossing their path, of getting in their way when they wanted something. I want to start off by saying that paranormal experiences never happened to me. I had a pretty standard childhood and am currently in my mid-30s. This experience, which happened when I was 25, was my first. For context, I had just graduated college but was having a hard time finding a job in the area I went to school. Eventually, the lease on my apartment ran out, and my parents offered to let me stay with them until I found some work. My parents had moved to a town near my hometown a few years into my college career. They, like many parents, wanted something smaller. One story because my dad has bad knees and just quieter in general. The town they moved to was slightly bigger than my hometown, but he had more in it, so they were close to stores, hospitals, post offices, and all that. Overall, I liked the house. It was cute, small, but fit the way their lives were going. They offered me the second bedroom, which was just being used for storage, and I moved in with a temporary setup. Their bedroom was on the other side of the house with the kitchen and a full bathroom between, so we had some privacy. For the first week, I just hung out with my parents, enjoyed a few home-cooked meals, and took it easy. Eventually, I needed to get to work trying to find a job. I had a laptop, but to give my parents some space, I'd usually head down to the local library and hang out in their community room. I spent a lot of time there the first few weeks just getting my resume up and running, joining job sites, searching, etc. I secured a handful of interviews and was able to spend a little more time at home relaxing before I went to work full-time. The first experience I had was in the middle of the day. I'm a little ashamed to say I was actually taking a nap at the time. My parents were out shopping and I took advantage of a quiet house and passed out. I'm not sure how long it was after dozing off, but I woke up just feeling like someone was in the room with me. At first, I was thinking my mom had come to wake me up. I opened my eyes just a tiny bit, in that half-awake state where your eyes aren't really open, but you can still sort of see what's around you. My room was dark, but something caught my attention. There was a figure standing near my door, and it looked almost beige in color. This made me blink a few times, trying to wake up and understand what I was seeing. Propping myself up on my elbows, I squinted to get a better look. I saw what seemed to be a ghost. I know it sounds strange, but that's the only thing I could think at the time. It looked like a young guy, just standing there, staring off into the room right past me. His form was vague and hazy, and he was varying shades of a soft beige color. I noticed him shifting from foot to foot a little, like he was restless or uncomfortable. Needless to say, I snapped awake, but I was too stunned to say anything or move. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. But even with all this fear and surprise, I didn't get the feeling that this was an evil spirit or anything like that. I held my breath, watching the ghost as closely as I could without moving. Everything in the room seemed to be frozen, like time itself had stopped. After maybe 30 seconds, something incredible happened. The ghost just began to dissipate, slowly fading away. It was like watching fog vanish in the morning sun. I thought about asking my parents about this, but decided not to, knowing I would sound silly and they would think I was just messing with them. For the next few days, I didn't see the ghost again, until one night when I woke up and he was in the same corner. I turned on the light on the nightstand, but he still didn't seem to notice me. This time he stuck around longer, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, before dissipating again. For about 3 weeks I saw the ghost on and off, only ever in the spare bedroom and the same spot. He never spoke, moved, or indicated that he was aware I was in the room, too. About 2 months later, right before I moved out and into an apartment nearby, I casually asked my parents who had owned the house before them. Another couple their age, they told me, with a few kids. I asked if they knew of any accidents, but didn't ask outright about deaths. They definitely picked up on the odd question, and I let it drop. I've never found out why the ghost appeared in that room, and my parents have never brought up seeing him. Part of me thinks because he disappeared for my last few weeks there and I never saw him again, that it was just a random event. Maybe a spirit trapped in a loop that finally got free. At this point, I'll probably never know since it's been so long. I feel weird about bringing it up with my parents. They still live there, so maybe they'll catch sight of him one day if he ever comes back. But the experience made me realize that there's a lot more going on around us than we're aware of.